The US president is shaking up the fundamentals of global trade with tariffs and his rejection of free trade agreements. He's threatening to withdraw the US from the World Trade Organization because he thinks it treats America unfairly. Who's going to get sold a bad deal here? Welcome to Roundtable. I'm David Foster. Members of the World Trade Organization follow its system of rules for international trade. It's also the forum for sorting out disputes and for negotiating any new trade. With America's shift towards protectionism, tariffs on imports and economic isolationism, is it more relevant than ever?
The World Trade Organization has rarely been in the public eye so much, but it's now a regular feature of Brexit in the UK and US politics. Why does the WTO matter? And what happens if Donald Trump pulls the US out of it?
America first. America first.
The WTO has governed international trade since its foundation in 1995. Solving disputes between countries about global trade rules. It has 164 member states. If two of these have no free trade agreement with each other, then WTO rules apply when they do business. So, if Britain failed to reach a deal with the EU when it leaves the bloc in March 2019, WTO rules would automatically apply when they trade together after that date. One aim of the WTO is to remove the protectionist trade barriers which were blamed for worsening the 1930s Great Depression and leaving millions unemployed. But it has its critics, most notably President Donald Trump. The US president threatened to pull his country out of the WTO if it doesn't shape up, claiming it allows the US to be unfairly treated in global trade.
WTO's treated the United States very badly, and I hope they change their ways. They have been treating us very badly for many, many years, and that's why we were at a big disadvantage.
The US is a key force at the WTO, and this year blocked the appointment of judges to an appeals panel that decides trade disputes. Trump argues they're against the US, as most judges are from other countries, even though America always has one judge on the panel and a similar win-lose ratio to other countries. The WTO normally has 7 judges. By the end of September, it will be down to the minimum of 3, as the US rejects new judge nominees to replace those reaching the end of their term. By the end of next year, if the US continues to veto, it could be down to 1. Not enough to keep the appeals system working. The Peterson Institute in the US says this could return global trade to a power-based free-for-all, meaning larger states could use unfair trading practices to get their way without any legal constraints. The WTO is facing a major crisis. With Trump considering withdrawal, he threatens to disrupt global rules on trade. Does the WTO need reform to make sure it has a future? And could it survive if the US did leave?
And that is the question here at Roundtable. Joining us via Skype from Washington, D.C., we have Professor Peter Morici, former director of the Office of Economics at the US International Trade Commission. We go to Geneva next in Switzerland. Then we have Peter Ungphakorn, journalist and former senior information officer for the WTO. He was there for 2 decades at the Roundtable here. We have Greg Swenson from Republicans Overseas and the merchant bank Brigg McAdam, and Tim Skeet is with us too, former senior advisor at International Capital Market Association. We're going to try and find out what the WTO does, where it's going from here, and what damage can be done perhaps by what China, Peter Morici, is describing as the largest trade war in economic history. Is it already a trade war?
Well, I guess we're there. We're certainly in a skirmish, and we're on the verge of breaking out into full-scale warfare.
And what does that mean?
Well, if the United States levies another $200 billion in tariffs, that really will equate to a fundamental change in the relationship, especially if it goes from 10% to 25%, which is what I expect. My feeling is 10% is kind of a temporary thing.
So if China and the United States are at each other's throats, what difference does that make to the rest of the world?
Well, it depends on how they respond. our complaints with China are echoed by the Japanese and the Europeans. It's not a question of whether there's a major systemic issue, but how it should be addressed. My feeling is that the Europeans are going to be moved to do something. And I don't think it's going to be to reach an accommodation with China, because it doesn't serve their interests. WTO is dysfunctional, and Trump may be awkward about what he's doing, but he's a major disruptive force that is needed to reform the organization. Now, the question is whether his kind of disruption creates that reform.
Greg, I can see you nodding your head. I was going to go to the other Peter first, but we'll bring you into this, and then, Peter, I'll come to you in Geneva in just a moment. Okay, so you agree with some of the complaints that Mr. Trump has with the World Trade Organization, but what is he going to gain by withdrawing if he does so?
Well, and I don't think he will, first of all, but Peter brings up a good point. He's disruptive, and I know that word is overused with President Trump, but it's a good point. It needs fixing. And so I think that there's a consensus that China is a systematic trade violator or cheater, and that has to be fixed. I mean, even Chuck Schumer, you know, who's probably one of the president's greatest enemies, agrees with the president that China needs to be fixed. So I don't know that he's as upset about the WTO. He likes to throw a grenade in the room, granted, but I think he's just doing his usual routine where he makes a lot of noise. He says the WTO is bad, and he's a bit paranoid, and they're not nice to America, when in fact, you know, the U.S. has brought 16 cases against China to the WTO, and they've won the last 16 of 16. So, look, I don't think the WTO is the villain here. Peter's absolutely right. It needs to be fixed. There are some problems, but no multilateral institutions are perfect, and they need to be shaken up a little bit. If anything, I think China should be thrown out of the WTO rather than the US. Which I think is something that Peter
Morici agrees with, but we'll leave you out of this at the moment. Tim, I'm going to come to you in just a moment, but I want to go to the other Peter in Geneva first, because you worked for the WTO, and one of the things that I've read is that it finds it very difficult to deal with China because it's used to free markets, it's used to transparency and countries that operate on a certain set of rules. China doesn't do this. It's all pervasive there, and it's very difficult to see what is or isn't cheating. Is that fair?
Well, it's a complaint that we hear quite a lot, but there are also people who argue that if you actually bring China to a dispute in the WTO, eventually you can get your way. So it's not as clear-cut as that. I would also comment on the idea that the WTO is unfair to the US. I think the rest of the world would consider that in the history of the WTO, the US has been the dominant party in there, along perhaps with the EU. And that a lot of what happens in the WTO has actually been imposed by the US, or certainly conforms with what the US wants, particularly on issues like anti-dumping, which is an issue that now the US has complaints about how rulings have gone on anti-dumping, but the WTO agreement on anti-dumping basically is what the US demanded back in the 80s and 90s.
When you say dumping, because we're talking in another program this week about China and its waste products, so it's not that kind of dumping. You're talking about excessive production, which is sold off very cheaply, correct?
Yes, more or less, yes.
Okay.
At below normal prices.
Yeah. Tim, let me come to you, because I put the question to Peter Morici, and he gave me a certain answer, but it wasn't the answer to this question specifically, which is what happens to the rest of us if there is a trade war going on between these two economic giants?
Well, we're all collateral damage, to use a term which I'm sure most of my American colleagues will understand. At the end of the day, the world has built up a phenomenally interconnected trading system which does depend on the free movement of goods and services up to a certain point. And you know what? When I look at the US economy and I look at the European economies, I see a successful result. And when I see the growth in a lot of what are termed the emerging markets, again, I see a phenomenal success from the architecture that has been put in place. Now, that's not to say it's without its weaknesses, but it looks to me is that system has served us well. It can always be reformed. But, you know, I am worried that we are now plunging into a new, uncharted territory where the NAFTA gets ripped up, where TPP gets ripped up.
North American Free Trade and Trans-Pacific.
Yeah, and the Trans-Pacific Partnership. I mean, look at the way the Canadians have been on the receiving end of a tremendous amount of heat and invective This is about everybody being involved, and we have a strengthening US dollar, we have a powerful US economy, and that is having a dramatic impact on a lot of people.
When you say collateral damage, help those of us who aren't deeply involved in this understand how, let's say, for example, Argentina's trade with the European Union could be disrupted as a result of a trade war between these two major players. It doesn't have to be those countries. You can give any example you want.
But I mean, the difficulty is when you get to a point where there is no international arbitration, so there is no mechanism for dealing with a dispute other than unilateral action. Remember, it was quite clear from the opening remarks that the US president has stopped the appointment of 4 judges to the appellate court, that will be down to 1 single judge fairly soon if it goes on. He doesn't have to withdraw from the WTO. The WTO just falls over. And that is the current course. Without that, we have no agreed dispute resolution mechanism.
So this is the major problem, is it? Or are we looking at two, Peter Morici, are we looking at 2 elements here? Are we looking at the fact that the WTO couldn't possibly do its job properly if it didn't have the appellate judges? Or are we looking at the fact that there is this continued disagreement, international disagreement between these 2 economic heavyweights, China and the US? Or both?
I think there's a fundamental disagreement between China and all the other heavyweights in the system, the EU, Japan, and the United States. It's just that the United States is now finally pushing the pawn. The rules that we have in the WTO will not solve the China problem because it's not organized as a market economy. It's that simple. And to think that we can somehow or other reform the WTO to fit our relationship with China is absurd. Now, that seems to be the premise of Trump's trade war. Somehow or other, he's going to reform the Chinese. He's going to get them to stop targeting high technology, forcing technology transfers, and things of this nature. There's so many things that China does that really aren't adequately covered by WTO rules. My feeling is that's a mistake, that at the end of the day, it's either China goes or we go. If China goes, it may be possible to have a WTO ex-China, which the major powers then decide how they're going to deal with China separately.
Okay, so you believe China should be out. Greg, you think China should be out. Peter Ungphakorn, let me ask you, what is the likelihood of the World Trade Organization saying to China, because it's a relatively latecomer to the party, but what is the likelihood of it saying to China, thank you very much indeed, you've got to make these changes or that's it, you're gone?
Well, firstly, the WTO is 164 member countries. Secondly, there is very little scope under WTO rules to expel anybody, whether anybody wants to expel the US for using trade actions that may violate WTO agreements, or China. So if you're talking about without China, that would mean China voluntarily leaving, basically. There may be some loopholes, minor loopholes, but basically that's the case. I also think we need to separate the issues of the trade war with China, if you want to call it a trade war, and the issue of the appellate body judges. And I think we need to also be clear that they are appellate body judges. They're judges that deal with appeals. So that doesn't mean to say that there won't be rulings, because rulings are done by panels. There's a first stage in dispute settlement. And there are people who are trying to think about ways of working around that. Well, firstly, to see if they can solve the issue of appellate body judges. And I would add also that this started under the Obama regime, not under Trump. It's just that Trump has sort of hardened on that. There are people trying to see talking behind the scenes to see if they can solve that, but also there are possible ways around it, but it would probably exclude the US.
Okay, I'm going to throw this one out. I know you want to say something, but I'm going to throw this one out to each one of you, and any one of you can pick up on it. In that Monty Python film, there's that line which says, what have the Romans ever done for us? And they come back with a list of straight roads, warm baths, running water, etc. The list is endless. So what has the World Trade Organization done for us? What are its real benefits? Who wants to start?
Well, I mean, look, I think we've, as I said right earlier, we've got booming markets, we've got international trade, we have...
but would we not have had it without WTO and its predecessor GATT?
Because we have a mechanism which does get people around the table and agree common standards of behavior. And you know what? If you go back 80 years, remember you go back 80 or 90 years and we had people at war with each other, lobbing bombs and missiles at each other. Today we actually have people trading with each other, broadly speaking, amongst the grand economies. We've seen phenomenal growth right the way around the globe in some of the markets which didn't exist 80 to 90 years ago. Now, you know, I think getting people around and agreeing common rules is part of the process that's got us to where we are today.
Okay.
Change them, by all means, modify them, but don't ditch them and throw them out.
And then we'll go into the changes in just a moment. Just to throw this figure, in 1960, trade as a percentage of world GDP, 24%. 2015, it was more than double. It was at 55%. So, Peter Morici, what has the World Trade Organization ever done for us? And secondly, how would you change it?
Well, in the West, I think it's done a great deal. I think that we need to continue to modernize it for Western economies with regard to technology. I think we need to do some fundamental things about antitrust, competition policy enforcement. There's a lot of basic conflict there. But I think we need to recognize what the WTO is. It's an international agreement. It's not like the Constitution of the United States. It doesn't have the same kind of durability. Any nation can pull out. Conversely, if the European Union, the Americans and the Japanese decide they just can't operate with China on the basis of WTO rules, they don't have to play by WTO rules with China. It's an international agreement. It really, the Chinese would be able to do much of anything. There's a tendency in Europe, there's a tendency in Geneva to look at the WTO, for example, the way they look at the European Union. You know, like once you're in, boy, it's really tough to get out. Well, tomorrow morning, the United States can leave the WTO without great consequences if it maintains its present tariff levels. I wouldn't trust Donald Trump to do that. But I think that conversely, the United States can say, look, we're just not going to play by WTO rules with China anymore. And if you Europeans are smart, you'll do the same. And that's got the Chinese scared as heck. I do know what.
Greg, I'm going to come to Greg on this because he's been nodding all the time through everything you've said, Peter.
I agree with Peter, and there are mechanisms to do this. First of all, the Marrakesh Declaration in 1994, which is really the formative part of the WTO, you know, they basically stated we believe in open and fair and free markets. China does not. So, you know, what's the point of having a participant or a member when they fundamentally disagree with the fundamental principles of the organization, number one. Number two is, while it's never been executed, there is Article 23. I mean, there is a mechanism in the WTO. WTO Article 23 says the other members can get together and throw out China. Now, could you get 164 countries to agree? No, but if Trump would maybe stop fighting with his neighbors and his allies, but I think if he got together with Japan, the EU, and Canada, they'd have and other allies and trading partners, you know, they could make a really good case because fundamentally China is a systematic cheater. Everyone agrees on that. That's not in dispute. You know, does this multilateral organization of 164 countries have the ability, the capability to do this and to make it right? I hope so. And Article 23 says they can.
Tim, I'm going to Geneva at this particular moment. It sounds like Eurovision Song Contest, doesn't it? Peter, in Geneva, if things are changed, what happens to Britain? Which may be having to deal, it may have to start dealing on World Trade Organization rules if there is no deal on Brexit. It leaves this country in particular in a right muddle, doesn't it?
Can I come back to that in a minute? Because I'd like to comment on your first question, which is what has the WTO done? One of the things we need to remember about the WTO is a lot of the work is dull and boring and behind the scenes and never hits the headlines. We're talking about things like trade wars and retaliation and dispute settlement. But basically, most of the WTO's rules in most of the trading sectors just operate behind the scenes. Now, the WTO has a role in that because when you negotiate, everything comes from negotiations. And when you've negotiated, you don't just stop once you've reached an agreement. There's a whole lot of work that's to do with monitoring and implementing the agreements that have been made in the WTO. And it's that work in dozens of committees where people are exchanging ideas, asking information about each other and so on. Again, it's not perfect. It needs to be reformed. The information, some of the information's out of date and so on. But all of that is really important in keeping this system working. What we've been talking about is only two issues. One is the appellate body, and the other is Donald Trump's trade actions in certain sectors. But the rest of the system is working really well. Now, it's true that if the US were to leave, it would weaken the system a lot. People's confidence in the system would be weakened. But it would take quite a long time for the present workings behind the scenes to actually come to an end. So trade would continue on the basis of WTO rules for a long time.
Okay, well, I'm going to put to Tim the question I put to you, which is what would happen. I mean, we're here in London. What would happen to Britain if there is a no-deal Brexit and we have to operate under WTO rules, and you don't know what those rules are going to be?
We don't know what those rules are, and I can only refer to multiple economic projections that show that this is going to be hugely costly to the United Kingdom and highly disruptive to all of its supply chains. And, you know, people who want to dispute that come up with nothing more than it'll be okay on the day. I don't think falling back on WTO rules is appropriate for a complex economy such as the United Kingdom.
Okay,
However,
I suppose what I'm saying is not so much is Brexit going to work, but if the rules of the WTO are changing because of what we're talking about, it makes it even more difficult.
It makes it even more difficult, and frankly, the United Kingdom thinks it's going to get great, friendly, open agreements with people who are lobbing bombs at each other, effective trade bombs. I mean, I think this is a tough environment for Britain to be looking to cut these fabulous trade deals that it thinks it's going to get, which are better than anything the EU's managed to do for it. But moving back to the central question, we have multiple difficulties being discussed at the moment. The United States is very fond on high-level rhetoric, the sound bites about particular countries. We have all sorts of issues around Russia, dealing with the Russians, dealing with India, which has got protectionist. I mean, there's got a moderating influence. They're starting to open up. But, you know, India's got its own issues as well. You know, we look around the world. This isn't about any one country. It's about just having a mechanism for getting people around the table to find reasonable solutions. And a little bit of tough talk every now and again helps. But
and will those reasonable solutions, and
now.
anybody can jump in on this one, we're sort of slightly run out of time, will those solutions involve a major shake-up of the WTO? Trump said, shape up, now's the time to shape up.
Yeah,
he also said trade wars are easy to win.
Well, yeah, which sort of demonstrates that he's ignorant of both economics and history. Okay, trade wars are not easy to win. Nobody wins, actually. Everybody loses. However, we all agree China needs to be fixed. So I think if it's big and it's disruptive, pull Article 23 and kick the Chinese
That's
out.
not a solution to any problem.
But
you know,
so they can continue systematically cheating and stealing IP and
this
running
is not quite where I wanted to go on this. I knew that it might come down to that. But Peter Morici, other than this Article 23 to which Greg refers, and other than throwing China out, what simple solutions are there to prevent this claiming an awful lot, as Tim put it, collateral damage?
I don't think there is a simple solution other than throwing China out or the United States leaving. If the United States left, the WTO would continue, but the Chinese would gradually compromise the system, and the Europeans would live in a world that they don't like. It's that simple. The Brits would live in a world that's even worse than the one they're going to live in with Brexit. The demise of the WTO in slow motion because of the exit of the United States would create an environment which would make it very difficult for Britain to redefine its place in Europe.
Is this one of the occasions where we might find, as has been suggested by Bob Woodward, that Trump's advisors are pulling papers from his desk so that he doesn't sign an order saying that his country should leave the WTO? Is it that serious?
I don't know that they would pull the papers from his desk on this one. I don't know that they would get away with that now that we've had those revelations about the book. You know, in the end of the day, he's president of the United States. You might not like it, I might not like it, you know, but he is. And if he wants to do this, he will. The important thing to remember is that it depends on which of his advisors prevail. If it's Lighthizer and Navarro, he may well do it. If it's Mnuchin and Larry Kudlow, he won't.
Peter, in Geneva, as the man who was on the inside of the WTO for so very long, is this going to get settled, or are we going to see something pretty ugly?
The idea of the WTO and multilateralism is that you reach agreements that help to sort things out and everybody benefits. If you lose that, then you have winners and losers much more severely than you would if you were operating in a multilateral setting. So what I would hope is that the countries who are talking behind the scenes, including China, would try and find some solution to this. And we know that they're trying. We know that even the US is trying. It's part of that negotiation.
It's going to be something that rattles on for a very, very long time. We will undoubtedly return to it here on Roundtable. And for that, we thank you for your company, and we hope to have your company next time. Goodbye for now.